Thank you for joining everyone tonight for for our second debate of the Lent term. I will not be chairing tonight. I will be handing over to Natasha. But before I do hand over to Natasha to chair this debate, I just want to inform you about some of the upcoming events we've got. So, of course, the next debate is the Brewster Debate. And some of you may not entirely know what that is. That's our annual competition debate where we have three speakers on either side, and the two of the best speakers will receive £100 each. And this will be based on the judging by two judges or three judges at the event. We will be publishing a form tomorrow for you to apply to take part in the debate. We also will have an opportunity for those who would like to give a short floor speech. So if you're in the audience and you'd like to give a short speech after the debate, there is an opportunity to win £20 for two people. The other thing to mention is that we have our AGM coming up the day before Brewster, and we will be electing our new president. Only our current members will be able to stand as president, but there are two positions in which we'll be electing, head of speakers and head of publicity, in which anyone is allowed to stand for. So if you're interested, feel free to contact me or Sean to get involved and perhaps put yourself forward for those positions. We'll also be voting on a new constitution as well. But that's everything for me. I will now hand over to Natasha.
Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for all joining for our debate tonight, and thank you for George for introducing me. So today we have our second debate of the term, as George has kindly said, which with the motion that this House believes that monuments to controversial historical figures should be removed. And tonight we have two on the proposition, Tommy and Excel, and we have two on opposition, Ryan and Ali. So before I kick off, I just would like to ask everyone to turn their speakers, their microphones and their cameras off and mute themselves if you can, and for speakers to only turn your mics on when it is your turn to speak. And there will be opportunities. So it's going to be two proposition versus two opposition. So we're going to have the first proposition speaker followed by the first opposition speaker, and then the opportunity for questions from the audience. So feel free to put the question you have in the chat, and then I'll read it out. You can either send it to me publicly, send it to me privately, or put it on the public chat. Following the first section of questions, we will then have the second proposition speaker, and then the second opposition speaker, and lastly, followed again by questions. And then at the very end, we will be asking for a vote just based on which side you think has won the debate. And so I think before we start, just out of interest, we're going to do a vote before the debate begins. So if you are voting for the proposition, so you do believe that monuments to controversial historical figures should be removed, please indicate a reaction using a thumbs up. So if you believe in the proposition. Okay, cool. And now if you believe in the opposition, please put a thumbs up. Okay, and is there any abstentions? Okay, great. So each speaker has up to 5 minutes to speak. Around 5:10, I'll just give a warning, and at 6 minutes, you will be muted. You're more than welcome to self-time, but Sean and I will also be timing at the same time. So to kick off, can we please have our first proposition speaker?
Hi. So key to this debate, we need to realise that any monument has its narrative. The monuments that we're talking about are not non-ideological depictions. Many are glorifications, valorizations of historical figures. And the controversy that's arisen now is due to specific monuments. They need to be recontextualised. new information, new interest in history, especially among the public, has caused a push for these monuments to be refigured. So they're not just these one-sided narratives of glorification, but instead monuments that open up public discourse and debate. And this process of recontextualizing the statues is history in motion. Historically, if you go back, despots, rulers, monarchs, they would take down the last ruler's iconography and assert their own. Now we're in a modern democratic society, the people get to do that. So when we wanted to put up, for example, Churchill's statue, we put that up. Now, if people want to take it down, they should have the right decision to take it down, and there should be a debate in place there. Currently, what we're having is a right-wing narrative. It's caricaturing the activists that want to change the statues as town hall militants, baying mobs, vandalising statues against the public will. But really, that's simply just to appease their voters. If you look up, on any site, you'll find that one specific fact that I found interesting was 10 out of the 11 of the monuments and statues in the UK that depicted controversial figures involved in the Atlantic slave trade. So a lot of these were benefactors, philanthropists, that new information, new light, new interest has shown that a lot of that money came from immoral means. 10 out of 11 of them were taken down by their owners or local authorities, not mobs. One of the ones that was taken down by activists was the notorious Edward Colson one in Bristol. But that really can be seen as a consequence of frustration, because historian Kate Williams has spoken about this, that the activists attempted to go through the due process, attempted to have a debate over it. They wanted a contextualizing plaque on Edward Colson, so both sides of the debate were realised, yes, he was a benefactor, but he also got that money through immoral means through the slave trade. But they were blocked by powerful interests at every corner. That's what she said. Now we've got worrying proposed legislation to protect these monuments, which is really all about taking the power out of the hands of local council to decide what's done with monuments and give it to the community secretary. That's Jenrick. He was the one that was portraying these people as baying mobs, and has said that he wants to wage war on them, on these woke activists. That move is revoltingly anti-democratic. It's silencing historical debate, and it's silencing the power of local communities to decide what represents them historically and into the future. The key thing is as well, this debate's not just going to go away. The irony is that the Churchill statue during the protests had to be boarded up. That's not satisfying either side of the debate. The activists that want to transform the statues, take them down, refigure them, they're not being able to do that. The conservative right wing, whatever we want to call it, side that wants to keep the statues up, their statues being boarded up. That's not working. What we really need to move towards is allowing local communities to have the power, have the decision making to recontextualize these monuments, so we can open up discussion, open up debates. In Bristol, where the Edward Colson one was brought down, the mayor has established a history commission. So that is the way forward. The history commission, the public discourse, the local decision making, that's the way forward with these statues. So really, a vote for this motion is a vote on the side of history, it's a vote on the side of the people, and it's a vote for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. I now welcome the first speaker of the opposition.
Thank you, Tash. As the opposition to this debate, it's important that I foreground what we seek and what we don't seek to argue. So we should refrain, and we will refrain, from judging historical figures by modern standards, but we do not seek to argue that. We also do not seek to argue that identifying the dual characteristics of controversial figures, because it can be difficult, and we do not seek to argue that either. Instead, I propose that the removal of statues has never and will never be an effective means to deal with our past and current challenges that we face in society, those being institutional racism and systemic discrimination that plague us today. In fact, the most effective way to deal with these problems that we embark upon, instead of the removal of controversial statues, an educational system that takes away this context and depravity that has gone around with these historical figures and educates us to this, because it's the process of education and socialization that really makes a difference. such as a recent psychological study by Anne Burt-Gistra has shown, that says that the social and cultural continuity of society is maintained by the dominant culture. And it is this dominant culture that is the problem. Without an effective means of education in our schools, where we understand the context and learn about these historical figures, we are being unwittingly squeezed through a system of socialization, which dramatically fails to give us any understanding of these controversial historical figures. This is why it would be truly more effective as an educational means than toppling statues. Tommy talks about the idea that removing statues actually enhances debate, and that the debate was silenced by people like Jemrick, when actually the removal of Colston's statue works to silence the debate. And here's my evidence. When you search at the name of Edward Colston on a normal Google search, the final result that pops up about Edward Colston dates back to the 8th of June 2020. That is now 8 months after the toppling of the statue, where the debate has been thwarted and the discussion has been made void. In fact, the only articles about Colston, which are directly on the news page, focus instead on the arrests of the people involved in the protests and not about the controversiality of the figure. It is true that a girls' school in Bristol changed their name from Colston School to Montpellier School, and it's also true that numerous streets have been renamed. However, these are small steps, but these are small steps that are clearly symbolic and do not affect the cultural change. I'm all in favour of these steps, and they are unequivocally in the right direction, and I do not dispute this by any means. However, we get into this cycle that has been repeated over the decades. Look at the David Lammy report in 2017, look at Baroness Young's report in 2004, and even as far back as the 1981 Scarman report. Clearly, these were all levied at deep-rooted social change, and they fell at the feet of the state. So the removal of Colston's statue has had no tangible or even legal effect on our society as a whole. Tommy also talks about the idea of dictators, for instance, removing these statues as a way to sort of move on from their past, and also as a sign of moving forward in society, when actually that's simply not the case. If you look at the process of de-Stalinization within the 50s and 60s, it was Khrushchev who, in his speech in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress, signified that there was a move towards the education and discussion of debate that surrounded Stalin's terror. This was crucial because it was a first step in Khrushchev's key de-Stalinization policy that would work to reconcile the people and accept their past and their involvement in their horrors. It's true that in places like Hungary, Stalin statues were eventually removed. However, this was only after the first stage of education that came through Khrushchev's speech in 1956. The statues alone do not affect change. It was specifically when you had the education effects and the encourage towards discussion that can't be found in the silence of the debate and can't be found anywhere else except for example, in Khrushchev's speech. Thus, the process of de-Stalinization and the case of Edward Colston and can only add to the mounting evidence that suggests that the removal of statues is not in itself an effective method to deal with the controversial historical figures. Instead, this process begins with education, as seen in Khrushchev's speech, and as seen in the need for socialization in the psychological study I mentioned earlier. This is separate to the silencing of the debate that happens when statues are removed, as I previously demonstrated. Clearly then, there exists a far greater value and a far greater effectiveness in the recognition and understanding through education that can be simply achieved by toppling controversial historical figures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. I now open the floor for any questions, so please do send through your questions either on the public chat or privately to myself. And when you do send a question, please indicate which side you wish to address. Okay, so we have a question for the proposition. So the proposition mentioned that having a debate over the removal of statues is key. How would such decision over whether to remove a statue be made? Would it require a simple majority or more?
Thank you for the question. I think the key thing is there's multiple ways of approaching this. Obviously in Bristol, the History Committee has been set up to investigate Edward Colston's role in the slave trade and gain more information and educate Bristol thing. I think the best place to have it is in the local communities. We can get all dragged down with the majority vote, super majority, whatever you want to vie for, but the key thing is that local communities have the decision-making power, and really, local councils and then public debates and stuff that can all contribute towards it. And yeah, fine, vote for it then, if you really want to vote for it. The worrying thing is, as I said, that new legislation is taking that away. But as long as we've got key local referendums, local votes, that's the key thing.
Does second proposition have anything to add, or even opposition to jump in? All right, so we'll move on to another question for the opposition. Can education reforms go hand in hand with demolishing statues?
That's a great question, and that's a very, very valid point. However, the point with the education argument going in with simultaneously is that the actual fact that removing statues actually silences the debate, as I said in my opening statement. So you have an issue where when you implement these ideas into education at a low socialization level to change people's opinions and to create a society that's more fair and equal and induce change through that, actually the removal of these statues works in opposite to that. It cannot be done in parallel, because the removal of these statues silences the debate. I said with Edward Colston, for instance, 8 months after toppling the statue, this discussion has stopped, and these are symbolic features. The idea of this history commission, it's entirely symbolic. Change has not been made, and sufficient change has not been pushed forward. It's entirely symbolic, and this idea that toppling statues actually has an effect on increasing discussion is completely wrong. The fact is that when you remove a statue, it silences a discussion, and then that works contrary to the work in education. Thus, if you have both, they cannot work hand in hand. And that's why education must be done separately and as a first step, especially since, and I'm going on, so I'll stop in a second, but there's a YouGov poll that was done in 2014 that shows that actually 59% of Britons are proud of the British Empire. And that just really emphasizes the need for education at this point. That is almost 2/3 of our society that believe that the British Empire was something to be proud of, something that derives pride. And that is a clear example, a scathing indictment on our education system. And that's what needs to change. Thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more question for each side, and then I'll ask a question at the very end. So another question for proposition. Doesn't your argument of refiguring historical monuments devalue your standpoint, and in fact more agrees with the opposition?
You could say that, yes, but what we're really trying to hit at is that it's the narrative that's the issue, the iconography that's the issue. So if you get rid of the iconography and just have some sort of historical plaque there, or relocation from these amazing public parks or public sidewalks where these statues are, relocate them or even sell them off, I don't think that's undermining our argument, really. And also, we've got to be realistic as well. There's got to be a pragmatic approach to this as well. We can take the statues down, but also we can refigure them. We can change how they're presented. That's the key thing that will bring each side together. And also with the, this is the thing as well, the education has already taken place. That's the key thing. People had already educated themselves on Edward Colston. They'd educated themselves on his other side of his history. And that's the logical step then, to remove the statue. It's not like now the statue's removed, suddenly people are going to realise Edward Colston was a slave trader. They've done their history. We're in an amazing time where the public can get historical resources and understand whatever part of history they want. And the removal of the statue was the logical step after that. Yeah.
Excel, did you have anything to add? Okay, great. And now one more question for the opposition before we open it back to our speakers. So yes, opposition. Why does it matter whether education comes before or after the pulling down of statues? Most people hadn't even heard of Colston prior to the statue being pulled down, which isn't really comparable to Stalin.
Yes, I mean, that's a great question. But the problem is that the education is the first step. As seen in history, the pulling down of statues only comes after the education and the sort of cultural integration into the curriculum. So Stalinism was an example. There's another example of denazification. So straight after the defeat in the Second World War for the Nazis, there was a huge process of iconoclasm where they removed all the statues, they got rid of any remains of Nazi flags. And then 20 years later, they actually introduced it into the curriculum because the effects had not been effective. The effects of this iconoclasm, this destroying of statues, had not worked for them in the way of dispelling this Nazi myth and the ingrained Nazi culture that had survived the defeat of the war, even then. So after 15 years, they'd worked it into the curriculum, and then socialization began to happen. The issue, as you say, with education, of why it's so important, is because socialization begins from a very young age. Socialization begins from the moment you set foot in school. So the 11.7 million people that are enrolled in schools right now are not getting the education they need. And it's this idea that education has already taken place. It's just false. I mean, I'm doing paper 24 now, which is modern American history. I've got one lecture on civil rights out of 32, one lecture. So all these symbolic issues do not fix the problem. The problem needs to be hit systemically and hit powerfully, and the government needs to make a change. And these symbolic issues do not make any difference, unfortunately. Thank you. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. Excel, did you want to jump in? Yeah.
Just on the note of denazification, I actually think that's a really interesting point to bring up, because if we follow the opposition's argument that these statues need to remain there for education, then they are proposing that a post-World War II Nazi Germany should have retained Nazi iconography for the express purpose of education. The problem with this is that even small increments of denazification that was not complete, street names that weren't fully erased, buildings that weren't reconfigured to denounce Nazism were held up as icons for Nazis years afterwards. I should also note that the reason denazification was properly implemented in curriculums throughout Germany a decade after the end of World War II was not because iconoclasm was not functioning as it should have, but because that was when East and Western Germany were able to establish a national curriculum for the first time. So that was a bit misleading. I should also add that denazification and the destruction of Nazi iconography is one of the best examples of why we need to consider the removal of statues as a priority for education. Because if we leave Nazi statues, they're not serving the purpose of educating people about the correct history of Nazis. Because Nazis don't put up statues of the crimes they've committed. They put up statues valorizing anti-Semitism and racism. And if we leave them in their place, they continue to serve the purpose of the valorization of oppression. That's the purpose. That's what they educate people on. Not the history of Nazis, but Nazis as Nazis wanted to appear. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yeah, you may respond, and then after that we will move on to
See, so the claim that I'm misleading is inherently false, because that fact was also misleading, because the whole point of removing the statues in Nazi Germany was that there was a process of social change that went on. It accompanied social change. It wasn't the only move. So to suggest that somehow the removal of statues had an overwhelming effect is in itself misleading, because actually it involved simultaneously and paralleled a process of social change that went on after. The Allies immediately formed a coherent government that went about with social change. That was immediately after. Yes, there were divisions in East and West, but for the west part of Germany, it was certainly happening. There was a process of social change. That's why you can't get bogged down in this idea that the inherent value of toppling statues is one of great effectiveness, because it's not. Because the only reason why it worked in that situation was because it was in parallel to and accompany social change through education, through culture, because it's not just in education. Education is this idea that, you know, I think we're also getting bogged down in this idea as education is something that is in itself only in schools, but education happens around you. Education happens every single day, not only in schools. So it's this idea of education and social change that happened that mounted on top of this idea of statues, and it was not intrinsically the statues that made the difference. It was the fact that it accompanied the social change.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone as well for asking your questions. So please do continue sending them through to the general chat or myself. So now open the floor for our second proposition speaker.
Thank you. First of all, of the 968 statues identified by the Public Monument and Sculpture Association, just 3 of them are Black people, and only 1 of them is a Black woman. We know, therefore, that statues are not supposed to represent history as it happened, but are instead supposed to valorize figures in history who are empowered. We know that Black women have existed in the UK beyond just Mary C. Cole, but what the statues demonstrate are empowered people having a place in society. It is also important, therefore, that when we consider the power that statues have, not for the representation of history, but the representation of empowered people at a point in history, we should consider that controversial people are not being removed just because of their modern context, but their popularity and their empowerment is entwined with their controversial nature. That's why these statues must be reconsidered, because having statues of Colston up isn't just about Colston as a philanthropist, but about how Colston got to his philanthropy. Considering this, we also know that statues in a public place don't just serve the purpose of decoration, but they have to be consistently maintained and kept up. With that logic, you would have to argue that statues being there for educational purposes also mandates that taxpayers should pay for the upkeep. So the idea that Edward Colston's statue remaining in place is educational also justifies my tax paying, my money, the taxes I pay when I earn my wages, should go to the upkeep of someone who sold and bought my ancestors as property. I should also respond to the opposition's consistent point that statues are there for the purpose of education, and that people need to know about these people in public places in order to better educate themselves on white supremacy. I would then pose a question. Do you think that the statue of Churchill or slave traders in public places serves to educate the British public about the empire? And does it serve to dissuade negative opinions about imperialism, or does it serve to encourage it? A man on a horseback with a sword who made his fortune causing genocides in the global South isn't telling people the British Empire was bad. It actually serves to tell them the exact opposite thing. So when we ask for the removal of these statues, we're not ending the debate. Step 1 is recognizing that these people were not simple, two-dimensional figures that just serve to improve human history. Step 1 is recognizing that I shouldn't pay money to upkeep a statue of Churchill. That's step 1. Step 2 is education. We can do both. It is possible to take down a statue and improve the national curriculum. 2 of them can happen simultaneously. And I refuse to engage with the idea that once we start taking down statues, the conversation ends there. Because for millions of oppressed people in the UK, the conversation has not ended there. My understanding of these people didn't begin and end with a statue being taken down. Maybe that's how the opposition sees the debate. But for most people, occupying the same space as people who historically have been oppressive does not end when the statue disappears. Oppression does not disappear alongside the statue. And I know this from personal experience. Everyone else who's experienced this also knows this. That's why pushing for change didn't stop when the statue went down. That's why these commissions follow the end of the statue. It's so silly to call it symbolic and entirely ephemeral and not useful when these have actually contributed to people being educated. Councils finding out about the history of their statue after people protest is not just plainly symbolic, it's impactful. It's especially impactful to someone like me. So it's a bit reductive to say that any commissions that go into investigating the historical, complex, controversial nature of these statues after they're removed is just not that useful or doesn't serve educational purposes. The fact that these statues have been up for, let's say, decades and no reform happened to the education system, and now that they're being taken down, people are considering revising the ethnocentric national curriculum that has remained in place and legitimized systemic racism for so long is not a coincidence. We are now more and more aware of the incredibly complex nature of British history. That's why these statues are being taken down, not because we're ending the debate, because the debate is twinned with our understanding of oppression. And our understanding of oppression does not disappear when a statue is thrown into the river. So I just wanted to note that. And to conclude, I think I really just want to target the idea that these statues belong in public places, and by taking them down, we're pretending that they didn't happen. That's just simply not the case. We know that statues aren't direct representations of history. We know that there are better ways to represent history that isn't a statue. We know that after statues of Nazis and Nazi iconography was taken down, they were replaced with Holocaust memorials, because that's a better way to remember the complex history of both the oppressed and the oppressors. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I now welcome our last speaker, our second opposition.
Monuments to controversial historical figures shouldn't be removed. As previously stated by Ryan, we should not seek to argue that controversial and dangerous historical figures should be celebrated, nor that they be immune from criticism by modern standards. Rather, we should instead aim to use these monuments to surface issues instead of hiding them in removing them. They should become places where communities come together to discuss and wrestle with the contemporary questions that we have. Public statues should be contextualized but not removed. They should be contextualized visually and dramatically and act to represent the layers of their history, from the story of their creation, and crucially, the reasons why they were actually problematic, and use them to present the stories of those affected by them and bring attention to these contemporary issues that the affected still face. These statues now represent issues that we face today, which is why they're being brought to our attention. It's the reason they have become a matter of debate today. But this debate is what is important. Cecil Rhodes, Robert Lee, Edward Colston, these figures represent how willfully blind people have been in the past to racial injustice. Those statues remind us of the catastrophic consequences of racial prejudice and institutional racism, and we should not let them stand and use them to remind ourselves of what we are not. Instead, by keeping these statues up, we should take steps to use these monuments to bring attention to what prompted the building of these statues, the fact they were revered, and what society they actually existed in and what society we have become now. Contextualizing them to present the reality of their wrongdoings is a key example of this. In the US, explanatory plaques have been put beside Confederate monuments to teach us this history. They detail the history of slavery, they detail the Civil War, and also the white segregationist history that they were actually built in. Next to a peace monument in Atlanta, Georgia, a plaque reads, "This monument should no longer stand as a memorial to white brotherhood. Rather, it should be seen as an artifact representing the history in which millions of Americans were denied human and civil rights." Allowing these monuments to stand isn't to legitimize the views of these 19th century slaveholders, these imperialists and Confederate generals, but it's keeping them in the public eye, and keeping them in the public eye in the long term. And instead, reframing them is what gives people the starting point, which is, as ever, sorely needed. To bring light to contentious contemporary issues and a more complete history is what is done by keeping these statues.
Great, thank you very much. Please do send any questions you have. I will now ask two of the questions that we received from the previous round. So firstly, to the proposition, are you saying that controversy forms a sufficient condition for a statue's removal, or are you merely saying it is necessary subject to a further referendum? If it is the second, then how have you proved the motion?
I am saying that sufficient controversy is enough to justify the removal of a statue, because how these figures come to prominence is tied to why they were made into statues in the first place. It's important to note that no one is proposing the removal of all statues, because every human being has had controversy. We're all complex people. We've all done things that maybe in the future would not be considered appropriate for different contexts, right? But no one's proposing the removal of the statue of trade union leaders or abolitionists or World War II soldiers, right? What we're proposing the removal of is statues of people whose ideas represent one thing, but their actions and their treatment of oppressed groups represent the opposite. So the example that's consistently used, it's someone like Rhodes, for instance. His statues were supposed to represent a moment of philanthropy and like the boom of excessive wealth, right? But we also know that he only got to that point because he was trading human beings. So that's an important part of understanding controversy. Controversy isn't just this person had complex things about them. It's this person was valorized. And the reason behind their valorization is absolutely twinned with the things they did that caused the controversy. It's not just that they had things wrong with them, it's that the things that were wrong with them are also paired with why they were considered good people in the first place. So yeah.
Does anyone wish to respond or jump on?
I think I'll jump on just in the sense that it's the idea of, it's this constant theme of valorization and also almost reverence of these statues. Reverence is an emotion. When we walk past a statue, we don't look at it and immediately feel reverence and awe at this incredible feat of this person who, saved this event or won this battle. It's more, I don't know about you, but when I walk past statues, I hardly even take a notice of them. They're there, they're passive. This idea that when a statue is there, it commands reverence, it commands respect, is just inherently false. I mean, we as humans choose how we want to feel. We experience how we want to feel, not because of what a statue is, but because of our education and because of our background. It's a socialized state. That's what our emotions are based on. The idea that these statues are there and they are endemic to this idea of reverence and awe is just completely wrong. I mean, I remember reading this one thing about you said, you crane your neck up to look at them and it's almost like this idea of reverence. Well, I mean, that's just completely false. I mean, I don't understand how a bronze figure built hundreds of years ago, probably due to benign neglect, is ravaged and, ill-looking, ill-faced. How does that command reverence? I just don't see the argument there.
Excel?
As a historian, you should know that men on horseback weren't just put on horseback because they're casual dudes who ride horses, right? Statues aren't just stick figures of dudes standing. You're aware of this. Historians and archivists have pointed out consistently that that's the problem behind putting plaques next to huge grandiose statues with men on horsebacks and symbolic animals around them, because the plaque is dwarfed by this huge. We are aware that statues weren't just there for decoration, and more importantly, statues are often not left to disrepair because we have local councils that pay money for their upkeep. It's very rare that I see a rusting, broken statue anywhere in the UK. That's the first one. Second one is, I'm really struggling to believe that you believe that when you see a statue, you don't feel like it was created for a purpose, because it's not just a picture of someone accurately depicting them. It's someone standing with a sword on their chest. It's Churchill with his neck craned up. Their facial features are more proportional than they would be in real life. They're made 2 extra inches taller than they would be in real life. Like, we know that they were made to express a specific message. They're not there without context. Whether or not you look at the statue and you're like, this guy is amazing, doesn't matter. When the guy made the statue, it was made to portray him a certain way. And if we keep it that way, we're maintaining the portrayal. That's like looking at Nazi iconography and saying that when you look at it, you don't feel like someone could like care about Nazis. They didn't depict themselves as they were. They were depicted to glorify them. Whether you glorify them or valorize them, the image of a swastika on an eagle's chest that's made out of gold and left in the middle of a town square isn't just there to be spat at or mocked at. When it was created with the express purpose of valorizing racist values. If you leave it in that context, or worse yet, you put a tiny plaque next to it saying, this is actually really bad. Historians and archivists have pointed out that that in itself is not enough to offset the huge image that's created by those statues. They were created with a message. They were imbibed with emotions and feelings. Whether you contact those feelings or not is irrelevant. The idea that human beings completely choose all their emotions, you can choose to be happy, you can choose to be sad, you can choose to like this, you can choose not to like this, it's really simplistic and overly naive. And it's just not a proper way of analyzing the impact that art and culture can have on us. So.
Thank you very much. So just a similar question from the audience that I want to kind of bring into. So I think this is directed to Ryan. If the statue is not of permanent physical manifestation of the, what is a statue? The permanent physical manifestation of a person, if not reverence?
I mean, the definition of a statue is that something constructed with the ability it's constructed as a personification of a person or an animal. Like the definition of a statue has nothing to do with reverence. And I just feel like I think if I understood the question right, you're saying what is a statue if you're not supposed to revere it? Is that well? I think the whole point of that is statues are there for memorializing events as well. So I mean the statues outside the Holocaust, the statues of the potato famine, in Dublin that I walked past when I went to Ireland last year. It's all these points. Statues aren't necessarily for reverence. Statues are also for memorialization. They're for reconciliation and recognition of events that passed. And it's that idea that, it's this constant idea of tax that comes into it as well. I mean, I don't know how much you think it costs to keep up a statue, but wouldn't you rather your taxes go to social initiatives that help change the education and help change the socialization of events? I know that I'd rather have my tax go towards that than repairing it or tearing it down, like the cost of building a new statue, for instance, in the place of that. I just think it's misleading. And also, getting back to the question, statues aren't necessarily meant for reverence. And that's the idea that, as Ali pointed out in his speech, like brilliantly, it's that plaque that recognizes that, sorry, I just got a message on there reading it. It's that plaque that recognizes the inherent historical value in it, but also criticizes it and demonizes it and shows how it needs to be represented today. That's the difference. If we acknowledge that, then it's not a spate of reverence. Instead, it's a spate of realization and reconciliation. How can we hope to reconcile our past and recognize it if we're just tearing them down and just forgetting about it? It's just like, and I know the proposition has argued that you don't forget about it. But I mean, I showed earlier that, the silencing of debate occurs when you remove these statues, and not in the sense of law, but the sense of symbolism. It continues symbolically. What's being done to change this? What is systemically being done? What is institutionally being changed since Colston's toppling? I haven't seen a single thing that's changed. Same with the movements in America. What has Joe Biden put through? What has he put through? There's been nothing changed after the result of these statues, and that's the problem, I think. It's not inherently an issue of reverence. It can also be however you want to feel. And the issue with these plaques as well, that then lets you understand that and acts as a source of education itself, so you won't revere it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for all the responses. I think we'll move on to a new question, and then if it does continue. So I've got a new question for the proposition. Does the proposition accept that if it rejects the dualism of historical characters, such as Churchill, as although he was a horrible genocide monger, he did help defeat Nazism. Would the proposition's focus on the lack of Black representation in regards to statues advocate the removal of Nelson Mandela's statue in Parliament Square?
That's a great question. I should first note that when I expressed the definition of controversial figures, I did note that there's a difference between duality and controversy, two different things. We are reconsidering Churchill because the fact that he helped defeat the Nazis was also twinned with his attitude towards people of color and subjects of the empire, right? He famously said that if the UK was to find themselves in a position of warring against someone, there couldn't be a better leader to charge against them than Adolf Hitler. That's not the exact quote along those sentiments, right? So when we think about Churchill defeating the Nazis and we see statues of him, in a proud stature where he's, proudly displayed, what we are seeing is Churchill, the man who defeated the Nazis. What we don't see is Churchill, the man who caused the Bengal famine, right? Because that was not the intention behind the statue. So when I describe controversial figures, I'm describing people whose current image is being disputed because the reason behind their fame is twinned with their controversy. When people think of Nelson Mandela, they're not simultaneously also thinking of his actions, like his actions that cause controversy, right? If we get to a point in history where Nelson Mandela's immorality overshadowed his accomplishments for Black South African liberation, then we should reconsider his statue. That's how history works. Because if we leave it up, we don't also contain the present moral outrage about the figure. We're preserving a version of history that doesn't contain the opposition of the oppressed. I hope that explains it a bit better. Human beings can have duality. Everyone has done something wrong, including myself. But if there comes to a point where my horrible deeds, if there's a statue of me and my horrible deeds so outweigh all the good I've done, take my statue down. Let the people whose opposition is being voiced have an opportunity to represent their discontent. If that means replacing the statue with something that contains information about what they did, or even like a different statue that shows not just their achievements, but also their misfortunes and their misgivings, then isn't that a more complete representation of the duality of human beings?
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so now we have a question to the second opposition speaker. You mentioned the educational element with regard to Confederate statues, but do you not accept that these were often just compromises to avoid getting into the justified demands of Black rights activists, for example, to take them down entirely?
I think in a sense, yes, they are almost justifications and almost a way of copying out and changing things. But what's important is the actual area of removing these statues doesn't actually remove the history. Instead, what these statues were, they were products of their time, right? And they depicted ethnic and cultural prejudices that were wrong then and they're wrong today. Removing these statues does not change the fact that these prejudices were wrong and that they existed. We can't remove that history. We can't remove what happened and what these people did. By erasing it, we just ignore what they've actually done. They don't represent today's society. And I'm going to use an example from Disney, I guess, and they use something quite similar, where at the beginning of their movies, where there are controversial figures, controversial racial prejudices that are depicted, they quote, to remove them from the way they're originally created would be the same as claiming that these prejudices never existed. And I guess by sort of with these civil rights movements and their demands to get these statues removed, it's almost, it happens in this moment. However, like Ryan said, it needs to be talked about again because these issues don't change what's actually happened after the fact and have these issues actually been removed. Removing the statues doesn't solve that.
Tommy?
I just want to note there that now the opposition is sort of splitting into two different discussions. You've got Ryan saying that these statutes don't affect people. You don't look at them. And then the rest of the opposition, you know, what's just been said is that actually these statutes are needed for learning. Why does all this learning have to be done under a glorifying icon of Confederate soldiers? Why can't that statue be taken down and have a new recontextualized monument that represents both sides of the narrative? The other thing as well, the Disney quote's an interesting thing. First off, you know, Disney have probably done that because it's quite different to monuments, because they want to keep selling their films and keep making money. But what Disney have done there is they've not kept, if the Disney films, you know, compared to a statue, they haven't kept the statue there. They haven't kept the film intact. They've added something to it. That's exactly what we're arguing for, not you. We're saying we want these statues to be refigured. We want new words on them. That's key to our debate, and that's how we're going to move forward. So the key thing is, what can you answer why we have to have these discussions under statues that are glorifying and only representing one side of the narrative? That's not going to help.
I'm happy to at least try and give an answer.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so I think the confusion comes from the fact that there's a paradox between removing statues and instituting educational change. So when you remove a statue, you do silence the debate. And when you institute educational and, you know, try and change the basis, the foundation that people are built upon through schools and the educational system, that actually influences change. So whilst you're silencing debate, you're also increasing debate. And that's why, you know, it was a question earlier that I answered. Those two things are mutually exclusive, because you can't do both at the same time, because you're silencing the debate and you're attempting to increase the debate as well. Like, it's essentially a zero-sum game at this point. And also, it's the idea that, I don't know, I'll let Ali come in about the Disney thing, because that was his point, if he would like to after. But I think it's just more that the reverence issue came up again from Tommy. And I thought that Ali did well to talk about how that plaque really does emphasize that there's no need for utter reverence of statues. And actually that is contextualized there. And it's not just contextualized on plaques, it's contextualized in the classroom. That's the point. You need the contextualization inside the classroom for socialization to begin. That's the first step you need to take. Toppling down statues has nothing to do with increasing debate. In fact, it's the opposite. It silences the debate, you know. But whilst, you know, you have these symbols, the symbolic gestures that happen, nothing tangible has happened. It goes back to Excel's point, you know, it may be empowering, but there's nothing tangible. There's no change happening. It's empowering among the masses, but systematically, institutionally, that's the stuff that needs to change first. And nothing will change in society without those changes as a primary move and as a primary step. I mean, if Ali wants to follow up, I don't know, is that allowed?
Just in response to one thing Tommy argued earlier, sort of what your side of the debate is arguing is that these controversial historical figures, these statues should be removed. We're saying that by keeping them, we have the ability to reframe and educate, like Ryan is saying.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question. So for the opposition, if controversial statues are so crucial to education, how do we bridge the generational divide in education on the statues? How does education not just reach the next generation, but also current generations who you have shown currently believe the empire is good?
That is a good question, bloody hell. Okay, so clearly we can affect social change in the younger generations of those that are currently in school through socialization and through the educational impact of that. Older generations, however, particularly, you know, as I said in the YouGov poll that you brought up, it's these generations that the problem may arise from. You know, the majority of Conservative voters tend to be above the ages of 40 and 50. So it's the education in those areas which could prove vital, which is, as the question points out. I suppose the assured way of making sure we reach them is, and the only way that can happen is systemic change. You know, the only way that the majority of the population are going to see any different or, you know, revolutionize their views, transform them, is if society acts first. We've seen the need for society to act, but nothing has happened. So I genuinely believe that as soon as society has acted, then there will be a slow process of realization and reconciliation, more importantly, about our acts. You know, as soon as denazification happened, there wasn't a consensus. You know, they were under this rule for years. There wasn't a general consensus. And the reason why the slow socialization happened was because of the process through which denazification took shape, took form of. It became a process. And it's that process that can help the older generations to catch up. A process of cultural change, of recognition, of plaques, of contextualization, of constant debate, of special news programs, of documentaries, of, I mean, just even maybe classes, you know, just general classes that you can attend, just a general understanding within the culture and society that you live in. And I think that can affect it mostly. You know, again, it starts with education, and we can reach these upper estuaries of people, these upper echelons of generational change who have been left out from the changes that are now going on in the education system by installing major social change. And how does that happen? It happens through the state, not symbolism.
And Excel, you may respond.
Thank you. Two things. First of all, I love that the opposition keeps bringing up Nazi Germany because it completely defeats their argument. If statues are absolutely essential to remembering the horrors of the past, if we're not to remove any like Nazi iconography, I'd love to quote the comment in the chat. Famously, the lack of Hitler statues means no one knows who he is. The fact that we've taken away the Hitler statues means we've forgotten about him. We took down all the swastikas, and now no one remembers the Holocaust. It's incredibly obtuse. I can't even conceive of why they would keep bringing it up, because if statues are there for memorialization and we should not remove them, but instead should add plaques, why are there Holocaust memorial like statues in place of where Nazi iconography was? Why didn't we all just add little plaques saying the Nazis were bad and they killed a lot of people? Why don't we keep the statues of Hitler where they used to be and add a plaque contextualizing everything he did wrong? Why do we have to take them away if they're there for education? Something to think about. Another part of that is I don't understand why the opposition believes that systemic racism and the removal of statues are like self-defeating. I don't get it. Systemic racism is not supposed to be undone by the removal of statues. No one honestly believes that. What we know is that as society gets hopefully less racist, the place for racist statues is not in society. These statues were put up at a time when people believed one thing, and since we're believing different things now, we're getting rid of them. That's because society is changing. If change wasn't happening, no one would want to remove the statues. I am just as, if not more, opposed to racism as the opposition. That's why I don't think these statues have a place in our public spaces. Because if things weren't changing, we wouldn't want them gone. I don't understand the idea that we must fight for the removal of systemic racism, but also make sure that no one touches the statue of Colston. Add a plaque next to his name. Don't remove it. Keep it exactly where it is. How does that add up? Why can't we do both? Why can't we take down a statue and put in the national curriculum that the British Empire was bad? What stops us from doing both at the same time? Can't our taxpayer money go to both initiatives? I don't know.
Great, thank you very much. Let me ask the second last question, also for the opposition. Statues are meant to inspire people. How can we have statues that do not fit with modern society's values inspiring people?
I mean, I'll take it if Ali doesn't want to.
Take it, I'll chime in.
Cool. Okay, well, I mean, that's a great question. But again, it's this idea that it demands inspiration. The memorialization of statues is not just for inspirational reverence. It's also, in fact, due to those things that we might not be as proud of. You know, I mean, especially certainly, I don't know what the point was before. Like, they didn't replace them. They've kept Auschwitz. They've kept Dachau. They've kept the first concentration camp. They've kept these camps so people can reconcile, so people can recognize what went wrong, and they understand. Like, I'm not really sure where this idea even comes from. Like, what, the Germans famously don't know who Hitler is? I find that very hard to believe, especially with the implementation of, you know, more educational reforms in the German curriculum so they can accept their past. So that answers the last question, but also this question specifically, inspirational characters, you know, as statues, they don't necessarily have to be inspirational. There's no statue, there's no statute book that says you have to have statues that inspire. You know, that statues can also be there for memory, for reconciliation. Statues can memorialize things. They're not just there for inspiration. So I don't know, you can follow up on that if I haven't answered your question well enough, but I hope that explains our position well. You know, that they're not necessarily for inspirational purposes, and actually the education that comes along with that is different. And again, I'll re-emphasize, it's this idea that it's not the point they can't go on at the same time, it's that they take away from each other. You know, the removal of statues does silence debate. I've shown that. The removal of statues prevent them somehow, you know, it starts at the state level. It's always started at the state level. The removal of statues does nothing to influence state decisions, well, currently at least. And that's proven enough by, you know, the report's not working. I've mentioned 3 reports. Those, nothing's happened in response to that. So the idea is not they can't both happen as a parallel to each other. The idea is that they take away from each other. You know, when you institute educational reforms, you try and increase the discussion and increase the socialization of events that happened, that now you can understand them more and reconcile the past. When you get rid of statues, the opposite happens. You silence debate, you completely create this form of history that was fake, that was full of false pretenses, and you fail to recognize the past in the way it was. You know, this whole idea of Nazism as well, it actually supports our argument more because it's a process. It wasn't just iconoclasm, and it was a process of complete cultural change. So it actually supports our point more because it was, and the point that supports our point the most is, again, the Holocaust. You know, the depravity and the realization that they had to memorialize this, the realization they had to keep on revisiting it, as to not prevent a cyclical history, as to not prevent Germans from not understanding where they came from and not understanding what happened in their history, especially with the curriculum changes. I don't know, Ali, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just on that point, with the Holocaust especially, it's something that has been very embedded, especially even in this country, that the government has put into the curriculum. It's compulsory in primary school, it's compulsory in secondary school. It's something that a lot of us know about. And just like in the Soviet Union with Khrushchev, it was that process of education that needed to happen first, that de-heroization needs to happen, that on a bigger scale where a lot of people, it becomes the norm that this sort of figure and what they've done is absolutely wrong. It's not something where, like with Winston Churchill, there's so much debate on him and there's so much opposition to even touching his statue, or to the point they had to board it up for people that wanted it to be protected. It's this idea that we need to educate people more on the wrongdoings of these people, and then use those statues to emphasize this and use it as a point of discussion in future, de-heroizing them, classifying them in history, putting it into the curriculum, and giving it a little bit more in terms of, it's impossible to ignore the continuity between the misdeeds of the past and the conditions people are facing in the present. And just removing these statues is insufficient, and it doesn't actually impact the education.
Okay, I'll allow one more response from the proposition.
Okay, thank you. So just to end this Nazism Holocaust debate, the Nazi statues glorifying Hitler, the SS, Himmler, the bunker were taken down. The camps do not glorify the Nazis. They show the horror that the Jews faced. Ali just said about making them non-heroic anymore. What we need to do is we need to take down the valorizing statues. And if we have monuments in place like the camps in Nazi Germany that don't honor, don't valorize, that's what we should keep. This is a debate not about taking down all historical monuments. The opposition are trying to shape it like that. This is about taking down controversial monuments. And the Nazi example just shows that's exactly what they've done. The education comes through taking down the valorizing statues and keeping the ones that show the true horror, show, another side of the narrative. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So one final question for both sides. Does the proposition, I'll address it to the proposition first. In what way can we imbue statues with semantic content? Is its content simply the set of the reactions people have to it, or is it solely dependent on the intentions of those that set up the statue?
Could you repeat that one more time? Just one more time.
Sure. So, in what way can we imbue statues with semantic content? Is its content simply the set of the reactions people have to it, or is it solely dependent on the intentions of those that set up the statue? I'll also pop it in the chat, but basically it's like, what exactly do these statues mean and what is their actual content?
On one of them, there are many ways to imbue a statue with semantic content. And I love this question because it actually moves on to the second reason, the second part of the question. We're taking statues down. Why? We can imbue them with better semantic context in other places, better semantic content in other places. So if we move, for instance, like a lot of Nazi iconography wasn't just destroyed, they were taken to museums. Rightly, the opposition identified that Auschwitz wasn't burnt down, it was turned into a Holocaust museum. So that's a way to imbue it with different semantic context. We're not just leaving this statue where it is, where it's costing taxpayers money to maintain the upkeep. We take it to a museum where it can be placed within the context of the oppression. That's a much better way to maintain the message and retain history without keeping a valorizing image in the center. So that imbues it with better semantic content. Of course, not every single statue can be given to the state, and most of the time, archivists don't really want cheaply made, quickly created statues just filling up museums. Most of the time they're sold to private buyers who create private museums. That's what happens to the vast majority of statues that are not destroyed. So in that way, they continue to be imbued with better semantic content that teaches future generations about their purpose, as opposed to being left in the town square where they're still being in the place that the original creator intended for it to be. So we've changed the content by replacing the context.
And does the opposition also want to answer this question?
Yeah, I'd like to start with just saying that's wrong, because if you look at government statistics, which is on the government website, from 2018/2019, 49.8% of people aged 16 and over had been to a museum once in the past 2 years. So 50% of the entire population had not even been to a museum or gallery within the past 2 years. So that in itself shows that when you move something to a museum, it actually works to silence the debate more, because less people are seeing it, less people are understanding the educational aspects of it, and less people are confronted with the issues that it brings. When you put stuff in a museum, it doesn't necessarily mean it has more historical sentiment or anything like that. It has the same value as being outside. You're just relocating the problem. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is that actually when you move it into a museum, it's less accessible, less educationally impactful, as proven by the government statistics. But I can get back to the question if you prefer. Can we imbue statues with semantic content? I think it's the same way with what Ali said. So I'll pass it over to Ali in a second. But it's that sort of notion that when you imbue them with semantic content, they don't necessarily have to be things that are revered or necessarily inspirational things. They're actually more as a remembrance. And that's the whole point about the Holocaust is that it's remembered, it's reconciled. You know, the whole point, also, I don't understand what's going on in the chat right now. The whole point is that it wasn't iconoclasm that worked. It was a whole process. You know, I don't understand what you don't understand about this, you know, in the sense that it was iconoclasm as part of a larger process, a larger initiative. It wasn't singularly that act that somehow made people appease themselves with Hitler or simply made themselves acknowledge with their past. It was a whole process that involved, most importantly, education. And that's one example. De-Stalinisation, that first process was, the first process of de-Stalinisation was one of education, as I showed earlier. So there's plenty of examples that would suggest that education is the first step. So, you know, a statue museum could be helpful. However, the simple fact is that the majority of populations, however much I love museums as a historian, I'm happy to admit I love a good museum, but the majority of the population do not share that view. Museums are great, but the problem with moving into a museum is that they are then almost pushed aside and rejected. So that's my argument. And the semantic issue can be Ali, I think. Ali, do you want to respond to that?
And I just want to chime in a little bit more on that point that was raised in the chat about a statue museum. Lorraine Smith, a professor at the Australian National University, actually visited historical museums that actually did this process of moving the statues to statue museums. She found that almost a negligible amount of visitors, less than 3% of the people that she interviewed, said they actually learned something substantial, as opposed to minor information from as opposed to being at a historical site or monument. When asked about the new displays, the people told her that they didn't even see it because the point of going to these museums was just to see people. So in America, they were eager to pay homage to former presidents, but they weren't actually there for the purpose of going to see what they actually did and readdressing these claims and getting that education. The education has to happen from somewhere else. On a slightly different note regarding the semantics, I think, again, it's reframing what these statues that exist mean. So, for example, Sophia A. Nelson, who's an author, she wrote that she doesn't actually fear that these 150-year-old statues, these old dead white men actually exist. They don't actually affect her. They don't change her life. It was her classmates at university that didn't want to have black classmates because of their racist hearts and their racial prejudice. She says that that's what we need to use these statues to work toward eradicating. When these issues arise in the future, we need the simple sort of concrete action of throwing these statues into a river and taking them down will have taken away a talking point in the future. And people will ask, why didn't they actually do something about racism as a result of it? These statues should remain, like I said at the beginning, as a material that point out that these people were traitors. They weren't heroes and they weren't actually meant to be revered. It's the ugly legacy that remains in these monuments that we need today.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for our speakers and for our questions and for our audience. So before we kind of wrap up, I thought we should do a final count of votes. So again, the motion, this House believes that monuments to controversial historical figures should be removed. So if you would argue for the proposition, please show a thumbs up or a reaction. Okay, I count to 5. And can I please have reactions for opposition? Okay, a bit difficult to tell, but I think there's around 14. And any abstentions at the moment? Okay, I counted 3. Great. I'll just quickly hand over to George now for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you everyone for coming to the debate, especially to the speakers. I'm very glad to hear plenty of statistics from Ryan, and also, of course, to hear that Jack Bailey is still part of the debate, even when he's not speaking. Just to remind you again, in 2 weeks' time, we have the Brewster Debate. Please do consider applying to be a speaker. There are 6 slots, so please do consider doing that. It is on the issue of this House believes that the pandemic has demonstrated the positive role of state intervention. And we also have, I can announce, Sir Vince Cable judging the debate. So do consider going and coming to that. And also, if you just want to come as an audience, then it would be great. You can have the opportunity to win £20, 2 of you, if you make a short speech as well. So please do come to that, and that will be in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.